want to welcome you to another in our series of discussions with ambassadors from NATO countries, ambassadors to Canada from NATO countries. And today we are really honored to have the ambassador of Germany, Her Excellency Tjorven Bellmann, who will speak to us. And it comes at a very turbulent time for all of us in the world. Last year, we celebrated our 75th anniversary of NATO. We had Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General in Ottawa, for a big meeting that we hosted. And it seems the landscape has changed dramatically, especially with the American elections. And now peace in Europe, NATO is imperiled. Earlier this week, a couple of days ago, actually, we had elections in Germany, which we were all fixated on because Germany, as the largest country in Europe, the biggest economy, is a critical pivot in supporting world peace and the world economy. So today's discussions, I think, will be very interesting to get Her Excellency's perspective from the German point of view, and I'm sure many of us will agree with her prescriptions going forward. Now I would like to hand over to our colleagues from Toronto in the NATO Association, Cam, Narayan, and Anastasia, who will conduct the interview. And again, Ambassador, welcome and good luck in your tenure here as Ambassador of Germany to Canada.
Thank you, Honorable David Collinet, for the kind introduction. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our diplomatic series exploring Canada's relations with its NATO allies and partners in an ever-changing global security environment. My name is Cameron Telch, and I'm a senior editor of the NATO Association of Canada.
My name is Anastasia Dyachenko, and I am an engagement coordinator of the NATO Association of Canada.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Narayan Srivastav, and I'm an event coordinator at the NATO Association of Canada.
Today, we will be discussing Germany's role in NATO. Before we get started, I'd like to give a brief history of Germany's participation in NATO. On May 6, 1955, the Federal Republic of Germany joined NATO to strengthen the alliance's role in deterring Soviet aggression in Europe. For the next 40 years, West Germany was the front line of the Cold War in Europe, hosting NATO troops to deter aggression from the East, contributing one of the largest militaries in the alliance, and ultimately reunifying with East Germany in 1990. With the reunification of Germany on October 3, 1990, Berlin was reinstated as the capital city of a united Germany in 1991, and the former German Democratic Republic joined the Federal Republic of Germany, thereby becoming a member of NATO. We will explore significant issues today with Her Excellency Tjorven Bellmann. Before we begin with the ambassador's opening statements, I would like to briefly go over her bio for our audience. Ambassador Bellmann has served as the German ambassador to Canada since September 2024. She previously held the position of Assistant Deputy Minister at the Federal Foreign Office in Berlin. In this role, her responsibilities included bilateral relations with Canada, the United States, Ukraine, the United Kingdom, Turkey, Central Asia, the Western Balkans, EFTA countries, and Russia, as well as the G7, NATO, Arctic policy, the EU Common Foreign and Security Policy, the OSCE, and the Council of Europe. Before, she was Director for Security Policy and served in various fields in the field of security policy, in the press division at the Foreign Office, as well as the German Embassies in Tel Aviv and Tehran. Ambassador, we invite you to begin some opening remarks before we proceed to the questions.
Thank you all. Thanks to David, the NATO Association of Canada, and to Cam, Anastasia, and Narayan for having me here today. It's a real pleasure. As you said, rightly, it's almost 70 years ago that the Federal Republic of Germany at the time, so Western Germany, joined NATO, and that Konrad Adenauer, our chancellor at the time, signed this accession protocol. And to me, it is still a miracle how our allies took us into this great defense alliance so shortly after World War II. Remember, the war had only ended with the German capitulation 10 years prior, after Nazi Germany had inflicted so much horror and damage on Europe and the whole world, including the Holocaust and the industrial murder of 6 million Jews. You know, the Iron Curtain ran right through our country. We were divided. We were not a sovereign nation at the time, and our, you know, what is today our capital was divided at the time. So with our admission into NATO, Western Germany gained back much of its sovereignty and was rooted firmly in the political and military West, which was a decisive step historically in order to secure peace on the continent. The Bundeswehr, the German armed forces, were founded shortly after. We got our first defense minister and reintroduced the draft a year later in 1956. And then the German armed forces developed into the backbone, really, of continental defense. At the height of the Cold War, we had 500,000, mostly men, under arms at the time. You know, an armed force that could pull up 12 divisions. And when you compare that to today's posture, where we have 180,000 German soldiers and a mere 3, soon 4 divisions, you can see the significant difference of the depth of defense and the defense project that we had to stem in our country at the height of the Cold War. You know all very well, I don't need to tell you this, how after the fall of the war, you know, both NATO and with it the German armed forces re-steered into mainly crisis management operations, which was a very deep, you know, deep change in the way we thought military, we did military, in the way we procured, from, you know, much more agile forces, including, you know, moving away from certain heavy weaponry and really focused on the type of out-of-area missions that we started to do when the war in the former Yugoslavia started, and then later after 9/11. And it was really these missions, and for the German armed forces, especially the Afghanistan missions, where we always held a very large contingent, that became defining in terms of careers, in terms of, you know, the collective setup of what our armed forces had been through these years. And collective defense, unfortunately, both in Germany, but also in NATO as a whole, with a few exceptions, very much was set at the back burner. And it was only with Vladimir Putin's rise to power that this, over the years, slowly changed. And not at first, but the writings had been on the wall. You know, certainly from the 2007 Munich speech onwards, and then in the years to come. And I remember very vividly how I moved into security policy from 2013 onwards, coming from posting in Tel Aviv, where you know, I dealt mainly with the Middle East conflict at the time, moving back to headquarters and into the NATO section, where I was a desk officer, and then moved up the ranks to deputy head of section and head of section. And in 2013 already, even to a newcomer like me in that area of work, it was very clear that the Russians were significantly increasing their nuclear arsenal. There were clear signs, though not proof at the time, that they were violating the INF Treaty. And then, of course, quickly afterwards, we saw the first invasion and the first war of aggression against Ukraine in 2014 with the attack on Crimea and eastern Ukraine. And whereas the Russians at the time still tried to hide their imperialistic agenda, and we all remember what has been dubbed as little green men, and, you know, combatants without the proper you know, signs of being Russian combatants, started this war. But it was the same playbook that we see until this very day. It took much effort over the years to re-steer the NATO tanker into refocusing on collective defense. It started with the Wales and Warsaw summits, which I was involved in very directly in negotiating the communiques at the time, with limited force presences in the east, reassuring forces, reform of our command structure, reform of the way we thought about defense, reintroduction of continental defense in Europe, etc. It took a lot of lobbying and pushing from our Eastern allies, who had a much clearer view of what Russian aggression and the Russian playbook was all about. And then in the end, we were still, I mean, there was this change, and there was this movement, and there was this realization, but we were still, to a certain degree, sleepwalking. And it really took this last invasion of Ukraine that started 3 years ago, with all the crimes and the cruelty that came along with it, to finally wake us up. And then in Germany, things moved very quickly. You will remember the famous Zeitenwende speech that Chancellor Olaf Scholz gave 3 days into the war, where he put an end to a lot of long-held policies, and decided that we would deliver weapons to Ukraine, that we would set up this fund worth 150 billion Canadian dollars to reinvest into our armed forces. We would procure the F-35, and we would get our act together and meet the 2% defense spending target. And ever since then, I think German politicians, in a way that I haven't seen in my whole career, have been very clear on the need to make our armed forces ready for a possible conflict that could very well come in the coming years. And I think the Defense Alliance today really is, again, at a crossroads. One element of this will be how the war in Ukraine comes to an end. And we are very clear, and the German government is very clear, that this has to be a peace and a settlement that is a true settlement that can provide sustained peace, and that is not a dictated settlement that we will never accept, and that would only lead to the next war and the next confrontation in the next couple of years. And that the Ukrainians need to sit at the table, and that we Europeans and Canada need to sit at the table, if we are to play a role in whatever kind of arrangement comes out of that. And it is the Ukrainians first and foremost that have to decide what is acceptable to them and what is not. It's also very clear that, given the fact that Russia already sees herself in conflict with NATO, although at the moment that's a conflict which is beyond the threshold of all-out military action, but a conflict that goes on every day, with sabotage operations, coercion, murder, threats of murder, the destruction of critical infrastructure, disinformation campaigns, malign influence campaigns, etc., etc. So the whole playbook below the threshold of open military action, that we have to be very aware of the fact that we see clearly that Russia is preparing for more, and that the way they are restructuring their armed forces, they are recruiting into their armed forces, the way the economy has been moved into a war economy, and the fact that we have seen clear intent of taking the ultimate course in order to reach an imperialistic agenda, that we have to be prepared for a deterioration, a significant deterioration of the security situation in Europe in the years to come. German politicians say today, and it's the defense minister, Boris Pistorius, and the chief of our defense, General Carsten Breuer, very clear that the German armed forces have to be war ready by 2029, not because we seek war or we want war, but because we need to prevent war. And that the only way to do that is to show very clearly to the Russian side that we and other NATO allies are determined to defend every inch of NATO territory, and that the price for the Russian side would simply be too high to endeavor such a renewed aggression, and for the first time an aggression against NATO countries. So this is where I see the alliance today. Not an easy task, given the fact that we see clearly, and we've seen it yesterday in the UN, and we've seen it across the past couple of years, a couple of weeks, excuse me, that the consensus that carried NATO across the past couple of years is eroding, and that we need to forge a new consensus amongst allies on our way to the June summit this year in The Hague, including a new defense spending target, an agreement on how to move forward on Ukraine and what role NATO has to play in that, and a firm commitment to keep our deterrence and defense credible in order to prevent all further aggression. Thank you.
Thank you for such a great introduction and for your opening remarks, Ambassador. Our first question is, as NATO approaches its 80th anniversary in 2029, the alliance faces evolving security challenges, including Russia's ongoing aggression, China's growing global influence, and hybrid threats such as cyber warfare and disinformation campaigns. Given Germany's increasing defense spending, as you mentioned, meeting the 2% benchmark for the first time since the Cold War, and its role in key European security initiatives, what vision does Germany have for NATO's medium to long-term future? And does Germany see itself taking on a more strategic leadership role in setting NATO's priorities, particularly in areas like defense innovation, cyber resilience, and European strategic autonomy?
Quite frankly, my and our first, second, and third priority for NATO is to keep the Euro-Atlantic area safe and prevent a major war in Europe in the years to come. And this is what we have to focus on. So this will include ramping up defense spending and doing so quickly, closing the capability gaps we still have, training in a very robust way in order to make sure that our armed forces can execute the defense plans we've all agreed on, making sure our armed forces are equipped and that we have enough personnel and that we are truly ready to defend every inch of Allied territory. I think this is the task in front of us. This is what needs our full concentration, including, of course, investment into future weaponry, and including the ones you've described. But we also see, you know, how extensive the drone warfare is in Ukraine. I'm not sure NATO is fully equipped for such a development. And including, you know, other theaters and other spheres of military action, including space, and so on. So there is a huge task in front of us, and it's really a race against time that we have to engage in and make sure that our defenses stay credible in the eye of the potential aggressor in order to prevent this aggressor of moving forward.
Thank you so much for your answer, Ambassador. And I quite agree with you that we definitely do need to look into that. My next question is that with Germany increasing its defense spending and taking on a more active role in European security through initiatives like the EU's Strategic Compass and the Joint Defense Procurement Programs, how does Germany envision its role in shaping stronger European defense framework? How does it plan to balance these efforts with maintaining NATO's cohesion and ensuring continued US engagement in European security?
I think both things go hand in hand. I don't think, I think that the debates we had in the past where, you know, more EU engagement in the area of security and defense, and a lot of it is, you know, the terminology is not always very precise around that, and the need to keep NATO cohesion and a clear understanding that collective defense in Europe for NATO allies is done through NATO and not through the EU, and that's enshrined in the treaties and enshrined in every strategic document we have. So I think that the unhelpful discussions we had in the past about competition between the two, I think that's gone. We clearly need to ramp up defense production. We need to invest in our defense industrial base. If the EU can play a role in this, and I believe it can play a role in this, then that's something which is good for the EU and is good for NATO. And we fought very hard under our EU presidency a couple of years back, and I've led these negotiations to make sure that initiatives that, you know, around cooperation on defense projects like PESCO, as we call it, the Permanent structured cooperation, that this is open to third countries that are not EU member states. And, we want to move forward with countries like Canada that is eligible for these programs to see how we can, for example, in a concrete project, we are envisaging now work on submarine armaments and other things. So I think both go hand in hand. The EU has instruments and has means to make sure that we ramp up defense production and we get our defense industries up to speed. The EU also has played a big role in in armament coordination and training for Ukraine, and through the European Peace Facility, which we also negotiated under our presidency, so that there are very helpful elements there. At the same time, it's very clear that in terms of collective defense, NATO is the organization through which we will continue to handle this and organize this. And I don't see that there is a disagreement around these basic parameters anymore. What we think is helpful in addition to all of that is to be very pragmatic in terms of how we do procurement. What we've done is, for example, there are certain industries and certain strategic weapon systems that we will do with key European partners like France, because we believe it's important that in terms of the modern Air Force or modern tank systems, that these are done in our industries. So this is why, for example, we have the Future Combat Aircraft System development with France and the main ground battle tank system together with France. But we've also very significant capability development with non-EU NATO allies. Take our submarine program, for example, which we develop and build and maintain together with Norway, which is not an EU country, but a NATO ally, which is also an Arctic nation. And that's de facto a very, very successful cooperation, which we hope we can enlarge to Canada, should Canada decide to join this cooperation as part of the submarine fleet replacement. The offer certainly is on the table. We have other forms of cooperation where we've created procurement coalitions. So in the area of air defense, for example, and ballistic missile defense, we want to make sure that a group of countries buy certain layered systems, because that creates economies of scale and makes the maintenance and the interoperability and the interchangeability to which we have, where we have to arrive to, much easier. We do the same now with deep precision strike systems. So there are various options on how to move this forward in various forms of cooperation. Some of it is EU, some of it is loose coalitions of the willing who get together to get these things done. And I think the more pragmatic we are, the better. We will always be a voice inside the EU which says whatever the EU does has to be as open as possible to non-EU allies.
President Donald Trump vowed during his campaign to end the war in Ukraine in 24 hours. Upon returning to the White House, Trump's administration revealed the complexities of ending the war, which could take months to reach a negotiated settlement. Given Germany's role as a key military and economic force within NATO and globally, does the German government envision working with the new U.S. administration to advance efforts toward ending the war in Ukraine and ensuring long-term security in the region? What priorities will guide Germany's approach to preventing future Russian aggression?
Look, we all want this war to end, and the Ukrainians first and foremost want this war to end, which has caused so much suffering. We've also been very clear, and the Chancellor and the Foreign Minister and all our politicians have very clear, is that it matters deeply how this war ends, and that a peace which is not a sustainable peace and not a just peace will not bring peace for long, but will only prepare the next aggression in the years to come. So for us, what is vital now is that there are no decisions on Ukraine without the Ukrainians at the table, and that Ukraine has to be part of these negotiations that have unfortunately started without Ukraine at the table. we've also been very clear that if Europe is to play a role, and we are ready to play a role as part of a post-war settlement, that we have to be at the table, and we will not commit to elements that we haven't had influence on, and we will not commit now to elements where we don't even see that Ukraine is part of the negotiation, and that we haven't heard the Ukrainians as to, and it is up to them really to decide what is acceptable to them and what is not. So I think at the moment the process has to be rectified in a way that those who have stakes in there sit at the table, and the American administration has committed to the fact that this has to be the case. And we are of the firm conviction that the sooner the better. It's good that we've had first occasions to engage with the new US administration on these questions. We've had a prominent US delegation in Munich at the security conference. We had the NATO Defense Ministerial just before. We've had a first exchange on leader level at the G7 yesterday. So all of these first engagements are important. They also show that there is still a way to go to come to a common understanding of where we are headed. From our point of view, it has to be clear, no decision on Ukraine without Ukraine at the table. Do not commit the mistakes of the past, neither regarding the Minsk agreements nor regarding the Doha agreements on Afghanistan, which have only led to a Taliban victory. Don't take levers off the table unnecessarily before the negotiation has even started. And be very aware what the Russian intent is. It's clear that Vladimir Putin will try, as part of this negotiation, to achieve, that agenda of his, which he hasn't been able to achieve yet, because the Ukrainians have been so courageous in their resistance, and because the West was very united in denying the demands the Russian side usually comes with. And if we manage to stick together and be united on that, I think we will be successful. But there are very important questions we will need answers to in terms of territorial integrity, in terms of Ukraine's sovereignty, in terms of the strength of Ukrainian armed forces in the future and their ability to defend themselves, in terms of security guarantees. So, whether that's a NATO membership as we decide to embark on, or whether that's some other form of security guarantee, it has to be credible. The aggressor is a nuclear aggressor. So a security guarantee that is not backed up by a nuclear power, and a major nuclear power like the US, probably will not be very credible. So these are very, very important questions that have to be at the table and that have to be discussed with all concerned.
Thank you so much for your answer, Ambassador. And I completely agree with you that the war in Ukraine has to end, and we all need to collectively include Ukraine at the table and do our part in helping Ukrainian people. Our next question is, President Zelensky has emphasized that NATO membership is key to ensuring Ukraine's long-term security and deterring future aggression. How does the German government see Ukraine's future in NATO once the war is over? Additionally, considering Ukraine's future in NATO, could the model of West Germany's entry into NATO be relevant, particularly given Ukraine's current situation of not having control over all of its territory?
Look, the German government stands by the decisions that heads of state and government of NATO have taken, in the last two summits. So from our point of view, there is a decision which we are committed to, that Ukraine will be part of NATO, and that the path towards membership is irreversible. At the same time, it's very clear that this is not the position at the moment of the current US administration. So we have to have a discussion what we are headed towards, and that if the administration thinks that NATO membership after the war is not something that they can agree to, then what the alternative is. And I think that has to be a very, very, very frank and open discussion, because we are, as I said, faced with a nuclear aggressor that has shown the intent to go to war over its imperialistic aims, and there is no guarantee that this will not happen again. And we must not create another Budapest, whereby we agree on things on paper that in the end have shown not to be worth the paper it was written on. So these are very, very difficult questions that we need to come to a consensus on, and we are certainly committed to do that.
Thank you so much for your answer, Ambassador. My next question is that as Canada and Germany are long-term allies and members of United Nations, G7, G20, and NATO, how do you see Germany's relationship evolving with Canada's role in NATO in 2025 and beyond as the federal election looms in Canada?
Look, we're very, very close partners and allies, both bilaterally as NATO allies, as G7 partners, in terms of the deepening relationship between the EU and Canada. And I think that that's deeper and goes beyond party politics. So I see a clear commitment on behalf of all the parties in Germany, both the current government and the next government, to continue to deepen this relationship. And I think the same holds true here in Canada. I think we have an opportunity now, given the growing debate we have here in the country in terms of diversification of trade or getting rid of the non-tariff barriers to trade inside Canada, which potentially could create an even more attractive market for European investment. We want to be part of that, of the solution, and we are certainly ready to do what we can in order to make that happen. And I think these are turbulent times where you have to know who your friends are, and we certainly know who our friends are and where we have to have each other's back. And you can rely on the German government and on the European Union in that sense.
Thank you for your answer, Ambassador. Canada has been a strong advocate for strengthening NATO's presence in the Arctic, while Germany has increased its involvement in security matters beyond Europe. Given NATO's growing focus on the high north, how do you see Germany and Canada cooperating on Arctic security and defense?
I think there's still great potential. I mean, we are not an Arctic nation, obviously. We are a world leader on Arctic research. We are a long-term observer in the Arctic Council. And we already have a trilateral partnership with Canada and Norway on, for example, maritime security in the North Atlantic. I think there is enormous potential to build on that and increase that. At the moment, it's mainly focused on, maritime patrol aircraft. We are all flying the same on maritime intelligence, and the picture we see on that type of cooperation, on doctrine, on how to become more interoperable, etc. But for example, would Canada one day decide to join the German-Norwegian Submarine Corporation, for example? You can see the enormous potential that is there, and our submarines can go under ice and can offer capability that Canada needs. In terms of Arctic in NATO, NATO has become a more Arctic alliance given the Northern enlargement. We have a certain multitude of architecture in the sense that the European part of the High North is done under the securest area of operation and sort of through NATO, whereas the North American part is done through NORAD. But I think there is potentially more that NATO could do in terms of identifying capability gaps, in terms of maybe joint procurement, in terms of exercising. And our cooperation already has increased enormously. We cooperate with Canada in a way we haven't done for decades, in terms of, for example, what our armies are doing in the Baltic states, where we serve side by side in Latvia and Lithuania, in terms of our Air Force cooperating more, and a huge potential for our navies to do more. And if the Arctic nations should want us to do more in the Arctic militarily as well, we are certainly open for that. As much as Canada has become a more Eastern European ally, we are happy to become a more Northern ally. But we are guided in this by what our Arctic allies want, because I'm acutely aware this is a sensitive issue. There are other non-Arctic nations that have ambitions in the Arctic, maybe that we don't want to feed into. So we are entirely, under your guidance as to how much of us you want up there and how we can best be of help.
Thank you so much for your answer, Ambassador. Our next question is, Germany has significantly increased its defense budget in recent years, as you already talked about before, and announced plans to modernize its armed forces. Given Canada's own efforts to upgrade its defense capabilities, do you see opportunities for deeper German-Canadian collaboration in military technology, intelligence sharing, or joint training exercises?
Absolutely. We already have cooperation in these areas to a certain extent. We are, in the intel field, for example, committed to try and negotiate a general security agreement with Canada, and I think there is broad understanding on both sides that this would be helpful. As I said, our armies, and I've just spoken to our chief of the army a couple of weeks back, are cooperating in a way we haven't seen for decades, really, if ever, because of the engagements we have on the eastern flank to secure the Baltic states, and we've been, exchanging much more on how we go about it, and we coordinate regularly, and we train, and so on and so forth. We have our special forces train in Canada regularly. We have a great potential, especially in the maritime field, to do much, much more in the future, depending on decisions here. So the potential is fully there, and we highly value the what Canada is doing for European and Euro-Atlantic security and for security on the continent back home. Whatever we can do to increase this cooperation, I think we are very willing to do, including in other theaters like the Indo-Pacific, where the German armed forces are increasingly more present with regular maritime deployments, and we've started also deployments of our Air Force, and I could also imagine that there is great potential to cooperate more in these theaters.
Thank you so much.
In terms of, if I can just say that, in terms of procurement, I mean, the submarines we talked about, we already have industry cooperation on frigates. We have industry cooperation in developing an anti-torpedo torpedo. So there is already that industry side that is backed up by government also in terms of future weapon systems and many more projects that I could think of we could do in the future.
Thank you so much for your answer, Ambassador. And it's always great to hear about potential areas of collaboration. My next question is that we've spoken about growing concerns over the US commitment to NATO. How can Germany and Canada work together to strengthen European and transatlantic security to ensure NATO's collective defense remains robust, regardless of the political shifts in Washington?
The US, both for Canada and for Germany, is and will remain our most important ally. That doesn't mean we don't have differences, and we've had these periods in the past. But I think there is an absolute need and an absolute commitment, both here and back home in Berlin, to make sure that this relationship stays strong and stays the backbone of our Euro-Atlantic alliance. Part of what we as non-US allies in NATO have to do is really speed up on defense spending and on getting, our armed forces on track and giving them the personnel and the armaments and the capabilities that they need. That's been a demand for subsequent US administrations in the past, and they, quite frankly, they have a point there. So I think we at least from the German side are very decided that this is something we need to do, not because somebody tells us to, but because we need it for our own security and it's in our own self-interest. And it's very clear to us that we will have to move beyond 2% defense spending, and the summit in The Hague has to find a new consensus of what that can look like and a timeline on until when we will achieve that. Because the threat is as it is, and it's no use trying to close the eyes in front of it and not want to see it. At the same time, there is a clear limit on how far burden shifting can go, which is built into the security architecture which we have in the Euro-Atlantic area and in Europe ever since the end of the Second World War. We have a nuclear architecture that has a nuclear non-proliferation treaty at its core, which clearly limits the nuclear powers in the world. And with that goes an obligation of these powers. The whole architecture is built on the fact that the Americans credibly extend deterrence to Europe. And as part of that arrangement, it is not only a nuclear posture which has to be credible, there is also a conventional posture in Europe that has to be pre-deployed in Europe, which has to be and has to remain credible in the eyes of the potential aggressor. So I think what we also need is a frank discussion as to what this has to look like and how we move this into the future, because the one doesn't work without the other.
Thank you for your answer, Ambassador. The war in Ukraine has underscored Europe's energy dependence as a strategic vulnerability, particularly Germany's reliance on Russian natural gas before 2022, which accounted for over 55% of its imports. In response, Germany has diversified its energy supply, rapidly developing LNG terminals, and expanding renewable energy projects to meet its goals. Given that NATO has identified energy security as a key resilience factor, how does Germany plan to contribute to strengthening NATO's collective energy framework? Additionally, with NATO members increasingly linking energy policy with a broader defense strategy, does Germany see itself playing a leadership role in shaping an energy-secure alliance that is less vulnerable to external coercion, particularly from adversarial states like Russia?
Look, energy policy in the end will remain a national competence. It's good that NATO has a discussion on the role of energy in security and the importance of energy for security and defense, and we've always supported that. And nationally, we have defined very clearly that energy policy is an integral part of our national security, and you will find that in our national security strategy, which I had the pleasure to oversee in my last job. And I think we've been very clear, and we've drawn our lessons from the dependence we had on Russian oil and gas, and have moved away from that in record speed, really. I mean, we, as you said, have diversified our energy sources. We've moved to LNG. We've sort of invested heavily on renewables, and I think any German government will be determined to continue on this path, and we have no intention of moving back to any such dependence in the future. And quite frankly, sometimes I would wish that other allies would do the same. I mean, there is still a reason why we've never managed to sanction certain parts of the Russian nuclear complex, and there is still too much dependency, including on nuclear energy, on Russia in other parts of Europe. And we would dearly hope that those allies that still have dependencies in this regard quickly move to overcome them as well.
Thank you so much for your inputs and insights, Ambassador. We will now open the floor to the questions from our live audience, who have indeed been very enthusiastic in asking a lot of questions. And for those watching, please continue sharing your questions in the chat, and we'll address them as possible with the time remaining. Our first question from our audience member is, Ambassador, could you please elaborate on how the results of the federal elections might reshape the political landscape in the region and impact Germany's role within the NATO and the European Union?
So Germany has voted, and the public has enabled the next government to form a stable, democratic, centrist government in the heart of Europe in the weeks and months to come. We have a clear victory for the conservative CDU-CSU party. And with enough votes for two parties possibly to form a government. It's also possible that three parties form a government, but the most likely government as of today would be a conservative social democratic government. The parties will now sit down and do preliminary talks and then engage in coalition talks in order to form this government. I think everybody is acutely aware that we want to do this sooner rather than later. And Friedrich Merz, who's won the election, has been very clear that he wants to move as quickly as possible to ensure stability. At the same time, it's also clear we have a fully functioning government until the next government comes in. The current incumbent government has all the necessary powers and can do basically everything until the next Bundestag constitutes itself in 30 days, and then even as a caretaker government, other than in other systems, it's a government that theoretically even could pass laws. So there is continued stability. I don't envisage dramatic changes in a lot of the foreign policy. The Friedrich Merz has been very clear that for him, security and defense is a core issue and an absolute priority, together with getting the economy on track and really making sure that Europe stays united. The commitment to Ukraine will remain. Both the current chancellor and the likely future chancellor have been very clear that we will continue to support Ukraine as long as it takes, and that we will not leave Ukraine alone, and we will not accept any dictated settlements over the head of Ukrainians. So I think you can rest assured that we will stay a very stable political factor in the heart of Europe also for the years to come.
Thank you so much for your answer, Ambassador, and that was a very reassuring point as well. Our next question from our audience member is that, Ambassador, you referred to facing a hybrid war with Russia. What is your opinion about the growing risk to the Baltic countries from within, based on the fact that there are a large number of Russian minorities there? How, in your view, NATO could mitigate this growing risk?
It's clear that the Baltic states are amongst the most vulnerable parts of the NATO alliance due to geography, not only the proximity to Russia, but also if you look at the geography, the fact that that it's not easy to reinforce in that area. So what is vital and what we've done in the past years is to have as robust a NATO presence as possible in those countries, which is why we and Canada and others are moving towards a fully fledged combat brigade in each of the Baltic countries. In our case, we have moved away from a rotational model and to a permanent presence there. So not moving troops in and out, but building up a force of possibly 5,000 troops in the country that will stay there, that will know the area well, and will be fully integrated into the defenses. And I think that's a very important and strong signal that any aggression towards these countries immediately would trigger a conflict with NATO as a whole, and we have to continue to do that. It's also clear we have now allies like Finland, which have a huge border with Russia, and we mustn't be under any illusions that once the Ukraine conflict comes to an end, and we see the preparations already, Russia will increase its presence along this border as well as in other regions. So I think we have to make sure that all these areas are as reinforced as possible, and that we are able to face off an aggression 360 degrees. Because if it starts, it'll be everywhere.
That is indeed true. Thank you so much for your answer, Ambassador. Our next question is, how does the German diaspora in Canada contribute to strengthening bilateral relations between the two countries? And what role does it play in cultural and economic exchanges?
You know, Germans, we are theoretically, I think, 10% of the country, but most of it is not really a diaspora. Germans have built this country together with other groups in a very significant way, and can be very proud of the fact how they did. At the same time, they've been very, very successful to integrate into the society and, you know, see themselves as Canadians first and foremost. And that's really what we want to see, right? We don't want to do diaspora politics. We want migrants that come to our country to integrate as well. And I think the Germans have been very successful here in doing that, and being a strong backbone of Canadian economy and culture and politics. Of course, there is still a lot of German culture around. We have certain provinces where German is still taught in school and spoken widely, which is great. And we want to help this as much as we can. There is still a lot of German culture and popular culture around, from Oktoberfest to Carnival to all these great traditions, and I'm really proud of those. And it's really, really, really nice to see. And it's an important part in strengthening our relations. But again, we don't see the German community here in terms of diaspora politics. We see them as proud Canadians that keep some of the traditions of their country of origin, but are Canadians first and foremost, that we are happy to engage with.
Thank you so much for your answer. That was indeed a very beautiful answer. And our next question from our audience member is that as Germany increases its defense role, does it see a future where the European Union develops a more independent security framework, possibly reducing reliance on NATO? Or will the European defense always remain very closely tied to the transatlantic cooperation?
I think NATO has been very successful and has been the most cost-effective and successful way to organize collective defense. So my hope certainly is that we can continue on this path also into the future. That, of course, depends on all NATO allies playing their role. And as long as that's the case, I don't think we should aim for any duplication or revisit the artificial debates we've had in the past. There is also, as I said before, a clear limiting factor, which is the nuclear architecture we have today. The security in the European theater relies heavily on the fact that extended deterrence, so the nuclear guarantee by the US and nuclear forces and nuclear weapons being deployed on European soil, as a soil, as well as significant conventional troops to back that up, including from the US, for the extended deterrence construct to remain credible. I mean, that combination needs to stay in place for the whole architecture to work. But the architecture, as I said, puts limits to what European-only defense could be. And I don't believe I believe it's very difficult to imagine an extended deterrence model which doesn't have a big nuclear power as the US at its core. If that breaks down, we have to have a very different conversation. So I would say, the more in the end, we have a single set of forces. What we have to do, and what Europe has to do, and what Canada has to do, is invest in these forces as much and as quickly as we can, in order to be able to deter renewed aggression. And the model around which we've organized ourselves is and was successful, and my hope would be for that to continue. And European structures have a great role to play in all these other areas in terms of defense industry and procurement and all these things. But as long as NATO holds, I think it's the best way to organize our defense.
Thank you so much for your answer. And I quite agree with you that collective defense is the most efficient and the safest way to go. Our next audience question is that, Ambassador Bellmann, can some of Germany's long-term energy and security needs be fulfilled by Canada, especially in regards to the use of LNG?
So in terms of LNG, at the moment, our companies have done their contracts. We rely. We have a strong LNG relationship with the US, and then we have contracts from the Middle East that will come fully to bear in the years to come. So as of current energy needs, I don't see a huge lack of LNG on the German side. And over time, we want to phase out LNG and move to renewables as part of our climate targets, which we will not give up over time. There is in Europe, I think, still a business case for Canadian LNG in principle. There are other European countries that are still in need of LNG, provided that there would be an infrastructure in Canada that would make that economically viable. But there's also a huge interest, including from Germany, in H2 and green H2 in particular. So there is a huge potential I see in terms of energy that Canada can bring to bear if we have the stamina to invest and make it economically viable and jumpstart it, which is always difficult until an industry is viable at the beginning, and that's really the area of hydrogen and green hydrogen. So. In this area, I think there is certainly a huge German interest in the future. We do that type of cooperation and try to do that type of cooperation with other countries as well. And whoever will be the market leader in this field will certainly be able to reap a lot of cooperation with Europe and with Germany in particular.
Thank you so much for your answer, Ambassador. And looks like that's all we have time for today. We would like to convey our deepest thanks to you, Ambassador Bellmann, for your sincere and incredibly insightful responses. Given the recent political shifts and evolving global landscape, today's conversation is especially timely. The strong and dynamic relationship between Germany and Canada remains crucial in addressing shared challenges from security to economic resilience. Germany's role within NATO is more important than ever in ensuring transatlantic stability and collective defense. I personally truly appreciate your discussion on defense production and the need for us all collectively to help Ukraine and stop Russian aggression once and for all to restore peace for Ukraine and its people. We appreciate your perspectives and look forward to continued dialogue in these critical times. I would like to also thank Honorable David Colonet for your opening remarks, to Cameron and Narayan for moderating with me, and everyone watching and asking questions online. And once again, thank you so much again, Your Excellency, for participating, and we hope to see you again soon.
It was an absolute pleasure, and please never hesitate to reach out.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Have a very good day.
You as well. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Okay, the live stream is done. Good job, guys. Just ended like a little bit early, but great job.